I've been reading Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And this is very interesting because Dr. Michael Brown and other Messianics, sometimes they cherry pick certain things from the early church fathers to make it seem like they're raving anti-Semites. But what we need to understand is that the early church fathers are engaging in apologetics. And so far, going through the dialogue of Justin Martyr versus Trypho the Jew, what Justin Martyr is doing is quoting from the Old Testament, proving to this Jewish person who's ridiculed Jesus and has rejected him, proving him through the Old Testament prophecy that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. And I haven't read the whole thing. Maybe there's some anti-Semitism in there. But what I'm saying is, this isn't the only book that Justin Martyr wrote. He wrote a couple of apologies. And we're looking at Tertullian as well. And a lot of issues and controversies we have today were dealt with by the early church fathers. And what has happened is Protestants have a habit of acting like the church just ceased to exist once the last word of the book of Revelation was written down, until Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg Castle Church. Nothing of significance happened, and the church was in just damn old heresy for all that time, for almost 1,500 years. But that wasn't the attitude of Martin Luther. That wasn't the attitude of John Wesley. They appreciated the early church fathers. And I'm an evangelical, I'm a Protestant, and I think that we should look at them and judge them with the perspective of, the Reformation or certain aspects of it. But when you're engaging in apologetics, a lot of these things the church fathers said and have done were correct. I mean, instead of cherry picking, I haven't finished reading the dialogue with Trypho the Jew. Maybe there's some offensive content in there. But a lot of what Justin Martyr is saying is factual and true, right? He's proving, so you have this Jewish man who's rejecting Jesus, and Justin Martyr is proving from the Old Testament scriptures and prophecies and arguing for the truth that Jesus is the Messiah, the King of Israel. And some of the concepts that he puts out there are what most Christians believe today, right or wrong, and his motivation Justin Martyr is to win people to the Lord. And it's very interesting, reading his testimony, how he came to faith, and him trying to find answers in philosophy until finally, probably a Jewish Christian at a beach met him and got into a philosophical debate and introduced him to the Messiah, and the prophets, the Old Testament prophets. That's what a lot of this book is. So in a way, the dialogue with Trypho the Jew, a lot of it is very Jewish, depending on how you look at it. But we look at Tertullian as well. And on his book on baptism, Tertullian is arguing for believers' baptism by immersion. So you could argue that Tertullian himself was a kind of a proto-Protestant. And his books are about apologetics. So, what I'm saying is we have to avail ourselves of the early church fathers. I think the corruption of the church developed over time. Probably, there were heresies that we deal with today. The early church fathers dealt with, and a lot of things that they said and wrote are absolutely true. I'll give you an example dealing with the Reformation. Recently, there's a book called The Foundations of Augustinianism, Calvinism, and the author, which I believe his name is Mark Wilson, is arguing that when it comes to predestination, the early church fathers, all the early church fathers, believe that people have free agency, that you're not a prisoner of fate or determinism, that you have the ability to choose and your own fate and have free. Instead of being prisoners of forces beyond your control, you can have freedom, true freedom in Christ. That you don't have to be controlled by obstacles or astrological forces. That you have freedom in Christ, and it's taught in the Clementine literature and in other writings. In fact, it's almost unanimous. So what do you do about that? So the idea that's being proposed is all the church fathers taught against determinism, until Augustine. And Augustine spent most of his life as a Gnostic, as a Manichaean Gnostic. So maybe he's introducing. So these Calvinists, they didn't look at it like, oh, it doesn't matter. It's like, because it does matter. It does matter what the early church fathers said. And so the argument wasn't, no, we're not going to even be concerned ourselves about the church fathers. These Reformed theologians, these Calvinists realized, wait a minute, it's important for us to show there's a continuity, that these weren't new and foreign ideas, but these ideas were represented by the early church fathers as well. I think that the weight of your argument goes with with Mr. Wilson in his book. And there's another book called The Myth of Pelagius, which argues that Augustine was the real inventor of Pelagianism, that Pelagius himself wasn't a Pelagian. That this is Augustine made a big straw man, Pelagius, that this is, so he is the one that created that heresy and tried to impose this belief and ideology which he constructed on Pelagius. Pelagius like, what are you talking about? But he realized to make his ideas normative. The book talks about that. So what I'm saying is that not everything, it's not like there are exceptions, but a lot of what the early church fathers was teaching is just basic biblical theology. And we need to avail ourselves of Tertullian and Justin Martyr, these other effective apologists in the early church period. The apologists have a lot to teach us. The apologists of the early church fathers period have a lot to teach us. This is patristics. It's very important for us to avail ourselves of this. But also, we should look at them with the Protestant or evangelical lens. But, there's throughout church history. Like Thomas Aquinas, some of the things, of course, he's defending certain aspects of Catholic theology, like transubstantiation, trying to come with an intellectual formation for that. So as a Protestant, of course, we're not going to agree with that. But what about what he wrote against Islam and other points of theological and philosophical inquiry? So, if we're going to do apologetics, we need to be educated, right? We need to be aware of, like I said, medieval philosophy. Beyond that, but just thinking about Justin Martyr, so he's converted in the 130s, and so his instruction goes before that, and also, he's schooled in the various philosophical systems, so he's able to effectively. Of course, he became a philosopher. He wore the attire of a philosopher, and he used that to advocate for what he considered the true philosophy, Christianity. So if we're going to get serious about apologetics, we need to read not just modern apologetics, but the whole 2,000-year-old history, and be aware of the contributions and apologetics of the early church fathers.